This program made possible by the City of Austin Watershed Protection Department.
One of the first things that I felt about Austin was this sense of place. The fact that we were on the cusp of the hill country and you had those rolling hills. The fact that you had literally a river running through the town and a place that you could go every day.
Pure water, gallons and gallons of water just pouring forth, and water is life.
We need those green spaces because they help our psyche to live in a very hectic world. Just a simple look at a park, even if you're just driving by, it makes you feel a little bit better.
Do you know how Austin got so much open green space for a city this size?
No, I don't. I don't actually know the history of it.
I moved here and it was like that.
The newcomers, I think, don't readily understand what went on in the past. But I think they come here because of that. They just don't understand how it got there.
The imagination of even the romantic will not be disappointed at viewing the valley of the Colorado and the fertile and gracefully undulating woodlands and luxuriant prairies a distance from it.
And when Lamar was coming up this way to decide where the state capitol was going to be, he wanted it in Austin. He was drawn here because of all the creeks and springs and the beauty of the area.
Austin was built on the creeks, the aesthetic sense of greenness and of natural beauty and of health has been there since day one.
Governor Elijah Pease and businessman A.J. Zilker recognized Austin's natural treasures and believed they should be shared with the community at large.
Governor Pease and his wife gave a huge strip of land running all the way from 12th Street out to 29th Street. And that was a big investment.
And also then Zilker Park and the willingness of Andrew Zilker to make that a public space. Barton Springs and Zilker Park, it's a special historic green space in the midst of an urban area.
In 1928, Austin endorsed a master plan which outlined the novel idea of creating a city built around Austin's creeks, a park city.
That plan did all sorts of things to shape modern Austin. One of the things it did was to establish the whole notion that what we today call the green belts could exist as natural spaces for people to live in.
In the vision of early planners, Austin would be a thriving and prosperous city, and one that consciously incorporated nature into daily life.
Austin was unique and it had recreation. Most cities in this country didn't have recreation per se.
At the center of Austin's recreation scene was Beverly Sheffield.
Beverly Sheffield went to work for Parks and Recreation Department here in Austin in the early 30s. There was one school that was available in New York to train Parks and Recreation leaders, and he attended that. And he came back understanding the basic principles of long-range planning, basic principles of open space. He just had this beautiful plan. He was looking in the future.
Well, we're in a very favorable position.
I was talking to him one day, and Beverly said, well, there's certain things that man needs, and man needs space. Man needs to be able to walk around in the natural world to recreate himself. That's what recreation means.
In his formative years, Sheffield came to believe that connection with nature was essential to the well-being of the human spirit. This belief would become the driving force behind his life's work.
I made my first swim at Barton's when I was 10 years old in 1923. Later, I became Austin's first aquatics director. I practically lived in a swimsuit, driving around Austin and teaching swimming from pool to pool. I planned the first water pageant at the Springs for the Chamber of Commerce in 1932. We had around 1,600 people out there. There were water-related programs of all kinds back then. In 1940, when Jim Garrison took a leave of absence, I became acting director of the Recreation Department. He told me that Barton Springs was a special place, and I had to be sure to take care of it.
Among the many patrons who reveled in this cool sanctuary was Roberta Reed. Although she and Beverly Sheffield moved in distinct social circles, they would soon become acquainted through their common interest in Austin's parks.
So she called herself Bobby, although, her name was Roberta. When we were at UT in 1936, I was a junior, and she was a senior. We lived next door to each other in the Zeta Tau Alpha sorority house. She was president of the sorority, a natural-born leader, and of course was a beautiful woman. She graduated in the spring. Sometime during the summer, she married Malcolm Reed. Of course, the blue bloods in Austin just were flabbergasted. This beautiful young woman had married this old man. Of course, he wasn't old, he was middle-aged.
Malcolm Reed was a successful businessman. Their marriage placed Roberta into a position of prominence in the Austin community.
When she was first married to her first husband, she went on a world cruise with him. And the most impressive things in the world to her were the parks in other nations and on other continents.
Deeply inspired by her travel abroad, Roberta imagined that Austin could, with careful planning, develop as a city with nature at its core. After Malcolm's death, Roberta remarried. It was during this time that she was appointed by Austin's first female council member, Emma Long, to the Austin Parks Board in 1952.
She was fairly young when she was appointed. As time went on, she began to take a more active role in terms of being somebody that people would listen to.
Roberta donated land from her personal estate for public parkland. This early gesture signaled her interest in the development of Austin's park system, a passion that would in time bring her into conflict with Austin's power brokers.
Surveyors get to work starting the development of a plot of raw Texas land, showing their foresight and faith in our city's dynamic growth.
After World War II, of course, everything started booming because more housing was needed, more kids came to the university. A lot of them, there were veterans, and so things started growing and growing.
And so when they came back, there was this expectation. You know, we wanted a house with 2 cars and a chicken in every pot was saying back in those days, you know. We were very optimistic. We were going to rebuild the world, which we did.
City policies incentivized Austin's transformation, offering cash rebates to developers, expediting the build-out of water and sewer lines. By the mid-1950s, a shortage of lots near downtown had investors looking to the hills. In rugged South Austin, a group of builders pooled resources and purchased a large tract of land on Barton Creek, next to Barton Springs.
Barton Hills, situated in 500 wooded acres of hills overlooking the city. You're likely to be impressed, too, by the fact that this new $53 million development is the world's largest air-conditioned subdivision. And there's so much to be admired about the dual nature of Barton Hills. You're so close to the city, yet you can relax in all the peace and serenity of country living.
The development of Barton Hills, I think, was a red flag. Having people talk about whether or not development close to Barton Springs could in some way damage the springs themselves.
The Barton Hills development alarmed Beverly Sheffield and fellow members of the Travis County Audubon Society. They feared that water wells planned for the new neighborhood would dry up the springs, disrupting the delicate balance of natural life that thrived nearby. They pressed the city to purchase the land. After stalling over price for months, the city purchased the 29 acres nearest Barton Springs.
The price is a little more than we would like to spend, but it is absolutely necessary to protect our biggest investment in recreation.
The purchase of a mere 29 acres was not sufficient to safeguard the future of Barton Springs. Repeated requests by Sheffield to purchase additional lands in the Barton Creek watershed, however, fell on deaf ears.
Beverly Sheffield, he tried to get the city interested in buying something, and nobody had any foresight. Nobody anticipated the growth that Austin has gone through. I mean, no way. We goofed, because they could have floated bonds and bought the watershed, controlled what little development went on it.
It wasn't long before the Barton Hills development was having a noticeable impact on Barton Springs. One resident came before the Austin City Council expressing concern. C.T. Johnson reported that rainfall washed trash and debris, including dead chickens, from the new Barton Hills neighborhood downstream and into Barton Springs. Uncontrolled growth was having an even more dramatic impact across town at Shoal Creek.
I grew up in Rosedale in the early 40s and 50s. We were on almost the outskirts of the city then. There were wilderness areas all over Shoal Creek. One was a falls, almost like a waterfall. There were quite a few swimming holes that people still use. One of them was down on 29th Street. I guess I couldn't have been much older than 10 or 11, somewhere in there. One day we go over there and suddenly all the machinery is in there and they're blasting out the sewer line through beautiful areas of the creek. I guess we thought these are always going to be here, They built a sewer line right up Shoal Creek, and I mean, they went straight up the middle of the creek, which of course is rock primarily, so they blasted all this out. Only later did I realize that once you blast the bottom of a creek like that, it's never going to flow again in a natural way. That stuck in my mind, the fact that progress is a double-edged sword.
Surprisingly, it was Austin's robust growth that provided the opportunity to enhance Austin's green space.
Longhorn Dam was built because the city was growing and needed additional power. The point of the dam was to have a cooling lake, but people suddenly realized this is a great amenity for the city.
In this raw land, Recreation Director Beverly Sheffield saw an opportunity.
Parks are good for people, even in a passive way. They're enjoying the open space. They're enjoying the environment. And I think we all have an interest in that.
Parks board member Roberta Dixon shared Sheffield's sentiment.
Roberta looked at that lake and said, this is a really wonderful opportunity. So she would take the city manager and members of the council out on a boat in that river and say, looky, looky, looky. We need for this to be public land. We can create green space on both sides of the river.
The choice at the time was, should it be primarily passive and nature-oriented activities, or a much stronger dose of commercial activities?
My passion was to get that lake preserved from motorboats and from all kinds of unsightly things as fast as we could, to get it zoned up, classified as a park, so it could not be desecrated.
In theory, the city supported the idea of a public green space along the shores of the new lake, but after 3 years, little had been done. Roberta took it upon herself to create a proof of concept for Austin's citizens.
She went out to her ranch and picked up her ranch hands. She and her crew from her ranch built the first quarter mile. It was an enormous success. People were walking up and down the next week and wanting more.
Well, Roberta Crenshaw was a very dedicated and energetic woman who wouldn't sit on the sidelines and wait for others to make the dream come alive.
Roberta proved herself a capable leader. In 1964, she was voted in as chairman of the Parks Board. Her new position facilitated and strengthened her collaboration with Parks Director Beverly Sheffield.
Dear Bobby, congratulations. I'm looking forward to working with you as chairman of the board.
I think the fact that she had money was important because she was part of a social group. She knew who to influence and how to influence.
Beautification, to my mind, is far more than a matter of cosmetics.
Ladybird Johnson was leading a growing national movement to enhance and preserve public open space.
Members of Congress, participants, and observers of the White House Conference on Natural Beauty.
Roberta and Beverly traveled to the White House where the Town Lake Plan was presented.
Natural beauty shapes our values. It molds our attitudes. It feeds our spirit. And it helps to make us the kind of men and women that we finally become.
Roberta and Beverly were energized by the conference. The Town Lake Beautification Plan was endorsed as a model for the nation. Back in Austin, however, Roberta and Beverly faced the reality that other plans for Town Lake were bubbling to the surface. Investors wanted to build an amusement park, 146 acres, straddling the lake from Lamar Boulevard west to Zilker Park.
They were going to do what was called Little Texas. They were going to have a submarine in the lake. They wanted to sky ride across the lake. This was going to be a touristic town, and it's going to be a showplace, and it's going to be marvelous.
It was not only the things that she accomplished, it was the disasters that she stopped.
Roberta knew that she could not stop Little Texas by herself. On the day before the council hearing, she arranged a private meeting with the bankers who were backing the project. It was a daring play to disrupt Austin's well-established power structure.
And I call it the establishment because they were the people that had always run Austin, and they'd elect their mayor, and the mayor made most of the decisions, and the council members just sat back and didn't study the issues and just said yes, and they had short meetings, and that was it.
As chairman of the Parks Board, Roberta argued that Town Lake was public land, and as such, it should not be used for private ventures. She was the target of thinly veiled insults from Mayor Lester Palmer.
History records that it only took one snake and one little woman to ruin the most beautiful garden on earth.
The Little Texas proposal was expected to pass, but to the surprise of backers, Councilmember Ben White joined Emma Long and Travis LaRue in a no vote against the deal. White had received an influential phone call from the bankers who'd met with Roberta the day before. The plan for Little Texas went down on a vote of 3-2.
They didn't tolerate me too well, I'll tell you. They thought I was just a real nuisance to them.
If you were a woman at that time advocating for natural space, you were a nuisance. And the way they dealt with that was by coming up with phrases like pushy Wilma and little old lady in tennis shoes, that just sort of basic core sexism that existed at the time.
Dear Mrs. Dixon, you have much more patience than I could ever muster. Some of the remarks
Do keep up your good work, your clear thinking and sharp tongue.
Here was this woman who had all the money she needed, and what she wanted to do was create space for people without money to go and enjoy the natural environment like she was able to do. That was a very progressive thought.
Roberta and Beverly had been working for nearly a decade to transform Austin into a park city. But it took Ladybird Johnson's clout and federal funding to make the Town Lake Beautification Project a reality.
I think Ladybird coming back to Austin and being here was good for Roberta. They may not have agreed on everything, but I'm sure that Roberta enjoyed very much working with her and sharing ideas and commiserating about certain male people who had a hard time dealing with uppity women.
The concept of creating a parked city began to take shape with the beautification of Town Lake. Roberta and Beverly's dream plan, however, extended well beyond the city limits.
They shared the vision, she being the outside person, he being the inside person, and they're sharing the vision of not just having a park system, but of having a world-class park system.
The odd and special thing was Barton Creek. That was a completely rural area. That had no neighborhoods upstream. So that was the dramatic departure and adding to this series of parks. People like Roberta Crenshaw were leading the charge that should be an investment the city should make. But it was all private land.
The state of Texas is just very clear. Land is for private property and private gain.
With the Barton Hills development dominating the east side of the creek, Beverly and Roberta focused their efforts to secure public parkland on the opposite bank. Part of this land was owned by Tom Bradfield, an Austin native and residential developer. Bradfield planned to build homes on the bluffs above Barton Creek, essentially cutting off public access to an area that had been used recreationally for decades.
Those of us who grew up here always thought of Barton Creek as a pristine, natural area that's canyonlands. I grew up here in Austin swimming in Barton Creek and Barton Springs and walking up and down Barton Creek. At that time, we were simply trespassing on it, but I don't think anybody really cared.
The conflict between the development community and conservationists had its genesis on this increasingly valuable land on Barton Creek, nearest Barton Springs.
Fortunately or unfortunately, we've always seemed to have been pioneers.
Tom had a love for this area because he grew up with the swimming holes, Camel's Hole, and with the springs. I think he saw the potential. Tom hung on to this property for 35 years. He could see that that's where Austin wanted to grow, and so he got out in front of it because it was where Tom thought people wanted to live.
The land out there was ranch land, some small homes, but essentially that was out in the country.
The Barton Creek area was not going to be out in the country for long. This scenic wild space at Austin's edge was about to be transformed. Since the late 1940s, a new highway called Mopac had been but a line on a map. In 1960, developer Tom Bradfield and others stepped up to nudge plans for the new highway along. they stood to gain if MOPAC was built adjacent to their land.
The Highway Department had already kind of had some preliminary plans about MOPAC, but it had fallen on deaf ears and zero budgets. They had no money for it. So Bradfield Cummins and several families that had an interest in the way Austin was being developed got together. They actually paid for the first origin destination study. With that in hand, the Highway Department agreed, and that was the beginnings of how the highway was to be built.
The urgency became apparent on buying the Barton Creek Greenbelt because development was beginning to get nearer and nearer.
Although a city commissioned report raised concerns about blasting in the delicate area along Barton Creek, the city council approved excavation for the laying of sewer pipes.
There was a lot of concern by Roberta. They were not getting sufficient response from the city. Bobby knew that one of the problems was the city itself, and not merely because it wasn't responding, but because it was doing as much damage as perhaps some of the developers were.
Roberta's concerns mounted as she looked ahead to Austin's future. In 1965, she and other parks leaders appealed directly to the citizens of Austin.
Mrs. Fagan Dixon is chairman of the Parks Board.
We have not been effectual in getting our concepts of the best plan for some of these very important areas sold, so to speak. And we think this is unfortunate when areas such as Barton Creek are coming up at this period of our lives, as I believe we'll not have such privileges again to plan areas like that. Once they are misplanned or the areas are bespoiled, then we have destroyed, so to speak, a legacy that nature really gave us.
The whole economy, the whole government system was set up to pave over the natural environment.
For many years, Roberta and Beverly struggled with the Austin establishment to direct growth around its natural waterways and green spaces. By the early 1970s, they would be joined by a growing chorus of Austin citizens concerned about the impacts of rapid urbanization.
This energy is there all across Austin because they're seeing that environment degraded at the university, they're seeing it degraded in Shoal Creek, they're seeing it degraded on Bull Creek.
Barton Springs, I was totally charmed by it. I thought it's just an amazing place. And I sort of began to realize that, oh my gosh, this lovely place and other parts of Austin may be in some peril.
Groups like the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club started identifying places in Austin and around Austin that needed to be preserved.
Increasingly frustrated with a lack of progress from city leaders, Roberta stepped down as Parks Board chair. It was time to try something new.
More and more enlightened citizens are going to become restless as they witness further environmental abuse.
We, as citizens concerned with the future of our beautiful city, will seek answers and solutions to these problems.
Using their own funds, Russell Fish and his wife Jeanette worked early on to create Austin's very first hike and bike trail along Shoal Creek. Roberta and the Fishes found common ground. Together with other progressives, they formed Austin's first homegrown environmental organization.
The Austin Environmental Council was formed in the hopes of really pushing the notion that we have to preserve the environment that we live in. They were trying to get the city council to institutionalize environmental protection. It very quickly became a thing that a lot of people joined. People who were coming to think of Austin as a place defined by its environment now had an organization, the AEC.
When I found out that there was the Austin Environmental Council, I found out where they were, and I went there and I volunteered immediately. Bobby Dixon would give me something to do. I would take a slide program which described some of the historic values of water in the Central Texas area. I would show that, like the Audubon Society or the Kiwanis Club. Most of the time it was, oh, this is great, thank you very much, but I had one woman who said, I don't care about this, I'll let my children worry about it. And I was in shock. I was in shock. But I think that that was definitely a thought, an opinion.
Creating systemic change would take time, and time to protect the lower reaches of Barton Creek was running short. Bradfield's land was already slated for development, and now city negotiations to purchase developer Jack Andrew Wartha's nearby property dragged on. Austin Environmental Council leadership worried that the creek and the springs might well be ruined if a deal could not be struck.
Barton Creek is our first priority. Dense development along Barton Creek, too close to the stream, will pollute Barton Springs pool and ultimately destroy one of the area's most valuable assets.
Propelled by a keen sense of urgency, the AEC leadership would soon take a controversial step.
As I was volunteering at the Austin Environmental Council, I realized that kind of behind the scenes that several of the board members and Roberta Dixon brought a lawsuit against those who were going to develop in those sensitive areas.
They charged that developers Bradfield, Andrew Wartha, and other landowners, by developing their land would, in effect, deprive the public recreational use of this natural resource. According to Texas law, if Barton Creek were declared navigable, citizens would have a legal right to use it.
I handled the lawsuit pro bono. It didn't interfere with the land ownership, but it retained the state's right to have public access. I felt very strongly about the correctness of our lawsuit.
The lawsuit over Barton Creek caused a rift in the community. Landowners bristled that their property rights were being challenged.
I think it is a capricious suit which may satisfy someone's desire for publicity, but I don't think it's doing this community, the landowners, or the general public any good.
Tom did not take it well. It's just the philosophy, the way people thought. You know, people who own property, that's one thing, but people thought they had the right to tell people who own their property how to develop their property, but they didn't have any ownership in it. And it was more of a socialistic attitude than it was, private property rights.
The reason that developers buy property ain't because it's supposed to help all the people in Austin. They buy it to make money. That's just what land is in Texas. It's money.
I think in a lot of ways, people who really don't have enough to do fall on that as a personal project.
I think what she wound up accomplishing was good, but it was just that she made a lot of enemies along the way, and, well, she was considered a radical.
Roberta's controversial lawsuit stalled residential development along Barton Creek, but in the area just upstream of Barton Springs, much damage had already been done.
The city of Austin ripped up some of the most beautiful creeks in town. First part of Barton Creek were just torn to smithereens by the city of Austin.
I had been living in New York City, then I decided to come back to Austin. I thought, well, I'm gonna go up the old trail that goes up to Campbell's Hole. I got out there and I was just totally horrified by what had happened.
As he viewed the destruction along the creek, Sturzing's childhood memories of the blasting on Shoal Creek came flooding back.
All the giant trees that were along the creek were gone. That's when I decided I'm going to try to do something about this, to stop it from going any further up the creek.
That very night, Sturzing drew up a comprehensive regional plan to preserve Barton Creek, one more ambitious and far-reaching than any plan yet conceived. Roberta and Russell's lawsuit involved the small parcel of Barton Creek watershed most likely to be developed. Sturzing's plan, on the other hand, proposed that the city use voter-approved bonds to purchase a more expansive area. His plan called for the acquisition of a Barton Creek Park, a vast nature preserve stretching 13 miles west from Zilker Park. Sturzing's vision, endorsed and promoted by Austin's Sierra Club, captured the imagination of the public at large. Linda and Alexander Moralatos took a lead role organizing public support in the form of a petition.
So the ad went in the newspaper. It was amazing. People of great stature had responded and had got interested in this.
Hundreds signed on to the appeal, urging the Austin City Council to approve the bonds necessary to buy the land. Eager to voice their support for the Barton Creek Park, citizens took advantage of a public hearing called to discuss new environmental regulations. The City Council chambers overflowed as Sheffield presented the proposals. Landowners, like Tom Bradfield, listened intently. Restrictions along Austin's waterways would impact what developers could do with their land. Citizens embraced the idea of new protections for Barton Creek and implored the council to purchase the land as outlined in Sturzing's plan. This, they felt, would serve as ultimate protection for Barton Creek. Moralato spoke on behalf of the Barton Creek Coalition.
There are not many cities of the size of Austin around the world that are blessed with such an extraordinary enclave of wilderness so close to the heart of downtown. A free-flowing stream with rapids, with pools that reflect precipitous bluffs. A marvel of variety of colors, textures, and shapes. A place to see flowers rarely seen in the city or hear bird songs rarely heard by city dwellers. These are the assets of inestimable value to the residents of Austin. Accordingly, we urge that along with floodplain protection, that the city undertake to purchase land along Barton Creek to extend from Zilker Park to Highway 71.
It's amazing how much public support there was for the green belts, not just the Barton Creek, but all of them.
The City Council agreed to protect Barton Creek, consenting to adopt environmental regulations and to begin buying up the greenbelt for use as a park. If the outcome of the public hearing was a victory for environmentalists in Austin, it came as a blow to property owners. Many of them were already targets in the ongoing lawsuit, and now the new ordinances would dictate how they could develop their land.
The world changed. It was very socialistic all of a sudden, and private property rights were getting thrown out the window. It's always vigilant if you're a landowner to protect your rights.
Developers organized against stronger controls along Austin's creeks. They argued the new measures threatened their livelihood, undercutting long-term land investments.
I did receive some communications from property owners that protested rather vehemently. Who do you think you are, and what sort of ideas you have about taking away people's property rights? Felt a little bit intimidated by this, and that's why I didn't continue my involvement with this cause.
At that time, Austin was growing pretty fast, and home builders, for a good deal of the time, ran the city. When it came to the environment versus development, the developers pretty much won out.
To the dismay of Greenbelt supporters, developers succeeded in postponing environmental controls. And now, prospects for Barton Creek Park seemed elusive.
Most people, I think, assumed, well, it's a done deal now. They're going to use this money. I think it was $2 million, or quite a bit for those days, and buy the land up.
Although the city purchased a few small parcels of Barton Creek land, larger deals were bogged down as values rose and price points could not be agreed upon. A favorable outcome in Roberta's long-pending lawsuit now remained one of the last strategies to keep immediate development off vulnerable areas of Barton Creek. The land in dispute wasn't the expansive Barton Creek Park that Sturzing had envisioned, but a judgment declaring even this small portion of Barton Creek a navigable stream would ensure public access.
Herman Jones announced from the bench, Barton Creek up to the swimming pool were navigable streams, but above Barton Springs, it was non-navigable and it was privately owned. I was very surprised by Judge Jones's ruling, and I can only speculate that I had some outside interference in that case other than the plaintiffs.
The ruling gave landowners the freedom to move forward with their plans.
They tried to get my land for free twice. Once by having it declared a navigable stream, and once by trying to push through a floodplain ordinance. Neither one worked, and now I'm just going to go ahead and build on it. My property was the heart of Barton Creek. It extended from within 300 feet of Barton Pool to well upstream of Campbell's Hole. Nearly a mile and a half of creek, but now I'm going to start building on it. Those who wanted to save Barton Creek had better forget it. It's private property now.
People by the late 60s who had been working as conservationists, it was beginning to wear them down.
I had to back off of all this political involvement. All of these things are volunteer sort of things. You don't get paid anything. In fact, you're spending money. I've got to get busy and provide for my newborn child, you know, and my wife.
The people who signed up that petition, including me, had sort of this naive notion that we'd put this big ad in the newspaper and everybody will say, oh yes, wonderful, save Barton Creek, save Barton Springs, and somehow this miraculously would happen. So there was a lot of naivete.
As environmental issues became increasingly politicized, Beverly Sheffield took a step back from public advocacy. Roberta, however, persisted in her efforts through her editorials and speaking engagements.
There were some developers building apartments right down practically into Barton Creek, very close to the springs, and that worried me nearly crazy. If you have some land that has a very sensitive area like the springs, certainly you should save those springs for the public and the purity of them and not devastate them, not take any chance of snuffing them out.
Roberta Crenshaw would not quit, and she had the courage of her convictions and her conviction that we must save the best land forever for the people of Austin.
After years of intense wrangling, to secure protections for Austin's environment, Roberta Fagan Dixon suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. That same year, Beverly Sheffield, too, suffered life-threatening health issues.
You don't realize, I think, what it does to your body to always hit up against that brick wall to make any difference whatsoever.
As Roberta recovered, AEC members continued to advocate for environmental safeguards.
I began to push for an office of environmental resource management. So we did lobby the city council, and we got them interested.
It was a landmark achievement for the AEC when the city hired Stuart Henry as Austin's first environmental director, an initial step towards institutionalizing an environmental perspective within city government.
Our job was to basically ensure that rampant development, even then, was doing as least damage as possible to the environment.
At AEC's urging, City Council also authorized a new Citizens Board to review development proposals. Developer Tom Bradfield sat on that board, across the table from members of the AEC. Together, they would attempt to come to consensus on what kind of growth was best for Austin. It would prove a difficult task at this time in 1972, and no less so in the years to come.
If you've got a citizens board, sometimes you can get a lot more things done through the citizens board than you can through the department head. Citizens boards in general are a way to communicate directly with the council members. In my view, that's great democracy.
By the early 1970s, the environmental perspective had been granted a formal voice inside the workings of the city. This was exactly what the early conservationists had been working toward for almost 2 decades, inspiring a green consciousness in the mainstream, creating a burgeoning political force which would demand protection and preservation of Austin's natural beauty. Austin's green identity was emerging.
Their victory was in really codifying an idea that this city could be defined by parkland, open space, green space. People were beginning to say, we want to live in a place where nature can be a thing that's built into the human community.
And we think this is unfortunate because we think...
Even though some of the people who started it were down by illnesses, that energy is going to pop back up massively starting in later in the 1970s and the 80s. And boy, by the 1990s, that's going to become a movement more effective than Bobby could ever have imagined. What will become the environmental movement in Austin grew out of what the conservationists were doing.
Today, Austin continues to build on the vision of early conservationists to create an interconnected system of parks and trails. Austin citizens consistently vote to buy land not only for recreational purposes, but also to protect water quality and preserve endangered species habitat. While private property rights remain dominant in Texas, in Austin, environmental values have become key to Austin's identity and to its economic vitality.
When somebody comes and sees Austin and says how beautiful and wonderful it is, I always say, and we had to work hard to get it this way, and we have to work hard to keep it this way.
This is a labor of love. This is a project Hill Country Conservancy is committed to.
Austin, Texas, with its uniqueness, should have been preserved to its fullest at the earliest point it could be touched. I've done the best I could, and I have wanted to do better. You know, I just feel like the challenge of beauty ought to be everyone's challenge.